Here is where we stand. The president has offered a compromise designed to circumvent a court order which would have required him to turn over the secret tapes to a federal judge. He has lost his attorney general in a dramatic resignation. Mr. Nixon then tried to get the deputy attorney general to fire the special Watergate prosecutor, and when the deputy attorney general wouldn't do it, he was fired. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
John Chancellor, NBC News, in a studio just feet from where we are now. The deputy attorney general who held his ground during the Watergate controversy was William Ruckelshaus. He died today at the age of 87. Ruckelshaus also headed up the EPA under two presidents. He was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Obama back in 2015. Even that seems like a lifetime ago. As his New York Times obituary put it, quote, "For many Americans, the deeds of Mr. Ruckelshaus' varied career were all but eclipsed by his role in the events of a single night in the autumn of 1973 as the political dirty tricks and cover-up conspiracies of the Watergate scandal closed in on his boss, the beleaguered President Nixon." With us tonight, Pulitzer Prize winner, presidential historian Jon Meacham happens to be the author of, among other titles, Impeachment and American History, to which he contributed with Tim Naftali, Jeffrey Engel, and Peter Baker. So, John, in addition to learning that the early 70s were a bad era for television earphones that stuck out on camera and that Mr. Chancellor preferred copy on paper to the teleprompter in front of him. Tell us about the man. I heard a historian tonight talk about Ruckelshaus as a patriot's patriot. Tell us about the mark he leaves on American society.
That's a great description. He was a part of a vanished breed. He was a moderate Republican. He was of the Rockefeller, Prescott Bush school of Republicans who believed in fiscal probity, but wanted to protect the environment and wanted to protect the rule of law. What I would hope tonight and going into tomorrow is that every self-described Republican supporter of Donald Trump would read that obituary very carefully and imaginatively project themselves to that ultimate moment of reckoning. Do you want said of you that when the Constitution was under ferocious attack, you stood in the breach and stood for the work of Madison, Hamilton, and Jay? Or do you want to be seen as someone who took a dive, which easily could have happened on that October Saturday in 1973? But Ruckelshaus believed in the rule of law. Elliot Richardson, who's the attorney general who resigned, believed in it. It was Robert Bork, a controversial figure in his own right, who ultimately fired Archibald Cox that night. That's a separate debate for another night. But I think that someone like Ruckelshaus, and we're almost exactly a year away on November 30th from the one-year anniversary of the death of George H.W. Bush, who also belonged to that company of men and women who believed in the system. They believed in the Constitution. And they knew that at some point, however imperfect they were, however ambitious, however many things they got wrong, they believed at the end of the day that the system, the country, was the thing that had to come first, and their own ambition, however much they had serviced that ambition, however much they had worked and driven through the arena with it, had to take a second spot.
Let's fast forward to a week from today. Second round of the hearings in a new and different committee for television viewers opens up. Tell us what high crimes and misdemeanors may look like in 2019, because the only thing your profession has in common with, say, a Supreme Court justice or a legislator is trying to figure out what the framers might have meant then as it applies to now.
Very interesting. You know, Gerald Ford famously remarked, another one of that company, by the way, he was about to become vice president in that same era. Ford said that a high crime and misdemeanor is defined as whatever a majority of the House of Representatives decides it is at any given moment. And that's true. But it's a phrase from the English common law. It's an ancient phrase. It was one of the checks and balances on Article 2 on executive power. very interesting that so much of the conversation in the Intelligence Committee hearings focused on the term bribery. That is the offering of a favor in exchange for something else. And so, and in the Constitution, there are three things listed for impeachment: treason, which has to happen in a state of war; bribery, the exchange of the now famous quid pro quo, the first time Latin has been used this widely since Rome. So there is one benefit here, or high crimes and misdemeanors. I think you're going to see more and more focus on the bribery as the Judiciary Committee takes over. The Judiciary Committee, remember, is where the fabled Watergate hearings unfolded. Peter Rodino, then Republicans like Charles Wiggins of California, Walter Flowers of Alabama, conservatives who wanted to stick with Nixon, but at the very end of the day, they were moved by the facts of the matter. And the question we're confronting now is, will the facts of the matter move those who have pledged their allegiance to President Trump?
And do you see, in the 30 seconds we have remaining, any reason for movement among Republican senators, provided that's where this is headed?
I don't. I've been struck by that. I like, and I understand the juror defense. They have to hear out, they're using that as a block to buy some time. But to get 67 senators to agree to go to lunch is almost impossible. And to see that significant a break with the president on the Republican caucus will be highly unusual. Here's hoping that there are some profiles in courage there who want an obituary like the one we're reading tonight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.